Morning? You can hear me? Okay, excellent. Well, I guess that's my cue. Lights come on. Well, good morning again. Pleasure to be here. I think all of you are repeats, but if not, I'm Juan Hernandez. I teach in the Bible department at Bethel. Before we get started, a lot of you have been asking me, do I teach anything online? Do I have anything available? And the fact of the matter is I've not taught an online course yet, although it's an inevitable slide that I must at some point. In the meantime, if you are so inclined, and especially if you suffer from insomnia and you need something to knock you out, here is a website you can go to, academia.edu. If you type in my name, Juan Hernandez, you will have access there for free to all of the articles I've written. I'll warn you in advance, a lot of them have to do with the book of Revelation and textual criticism, ancient manuscripts, Greek, stuff like that. But I do try to write them in a way that it's at least understandable in English. So if you're inclined, and again, if you're lacking a motive for sleep, this will do it for you. Really quickly, there is some stuff here on the Gospels as well. As a matter of fact, this series was born out of an interview experience I had where I was debating with a particular professor about the Gospels. And he had a very linear view of everything, a very dogmatic view of everything. And it was just one story, and there was no complexity. And it was an interview that I ended up torpedoing because I was just, well, this is what we have. This is what we have, right? So it could not gain headway. At any rate, it was a kind of a catalyst for what I started to do with this series, which is basically to just pull no punches, show you what's exactly there and why it's not a problem, why it's actually good. It just requires some imagination and creativity and some courage to learn and think in a way that's probably very distinct from the way all of us learned the Gospels. So that article is there. It's called Faith, Fundamentalism, and the Guild. You'll see it there. Also, here's my email, jhernandez@bethel.edu. In case you have a lingering question after we're all done, it may not occur to you, how many things troubled you till next Monday. And you're like, Hernandez, you got away with it, right? But the heresy monitor came on afterwards, and I got a bone to pick. So feel free to email me about that, and we'll go from there, okay? All right, so let's pick up on Matthew, and while I'm teaching, just pray that the Lord slows down the clock, right? We're praying for a miracle. I would love to get through all four of them. I think we'll do it. So we're now at the didactic quality of Matthew's gospel, and what that means, basically, it is a gospel that lends itself to teaching. Why? Because it is so well organized. It is far more organized than Mark, which is kind of rushed. It seems a little haphazard, rough around the edges. And Matthew just gives a structure to everything. And he puts things into groups. He loves to put things into groups, right? I imagine Matthew as being very anal retentive, right? Very much OCD. Everything in its place. Everything tabulated, right? Not a hair out of place, right? And you notice that as you go through his gospel and you look at how he arranges things, and even in the numbers that are used. And we talked a little bit about numbers. So I'm just going to go through this. He groups items into 3s, 5s, 7s, and more. I mean, I haven't given you all of them. We can literally spend probably a year on each gospel alone. There's so much interesting information in all of these. But you have him grouping material. Here are some examples. 3s, the genealogy is divided into 3 sections. We saw that this was unique to Matthew. Luke did not divide his genealogy into 3 sections. Mark provided no genealogy. And John's genealogy was very direct. Jesus is God, right? That's it. Straight to the point. In chapter 25, you have 3 parables of judgment. That's the other thing we see the gospel writers doing is they don't just say, hey, Jesus said a parable, and then just move on. Sometimes they take similarly themed parables and put them one after the other. Think about perhaps your pastor who says, we're going to do a series on forgiveness, right? And maybe for 6 weeks there will be 6 different passages on forgiveness, and it's a thematic kind of sermon series. That's not a new idea. That's not just a 21st century thing. The gospel writers were already doing that. And so you've got parables of judgment lined up as if to reinforce the point, as if to clarify the point, as if to emphasize it. Fives, you have fives as well. The 5 discourses, these were the 5 major teaching blocks we saw in Matthew that seem to mirror the 5 books of Moses. Mark has nothing like that. And Luke, for his part, has one huge teaching block, that travel narrative of 10 chapters, where he includes 10 parables not found anywhere else. Matthew divvies it up into 5 points. My professor at Emory University used to talk about these teaching sections as speed bumps, right? You've got movement, you've got narrative, and then all of a sudden you stop, and it's 3 chapters of teaching, right? Then movement and narrative, and then stop, another chapter of teaching, right? Slows you down so you can think and reflect and learn a few things about Jesus and what you are to do about it. The third discourse, so you got the 5 teaching blocks, the third discourse just so happens to include 7 parables, right? 7 is probably the most conspicuous number that you have in the Gospels, right? In the book of Revelation, I mean, you've got 7s of everything. 7 bowls, 7 trumpets, 7 seals, 7 churches, 7 angels, 7, 7, 7, 7. It's a very significant number. And of these 7 parables, 3 are grouped together, right? So think about how much thinking has to go into this kind of arrangement. And it's an arrangement done apparently so effortlessly, you don't even notice it as you're going through it. It was just the story of Jesus. Here are his teachings. We got a parable here. We're moving on to something else, right? But in the meantime, somebody had to map all of this out, right? And it just looks effortless. You don't even notice it. The 5th discourse, this is the 5 teaching blocks, includes 7 woes to the Pharisees. The woes are condemnation. It's not like a horse, whoa, right? It's not that, but it's basically like the G-dam of the Bible, right? It is kind of like, you are going to fry, right? And he has 7 of those issued against the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. That's almost a symbol of, you could take it as a symbol of perfect judgment, right? We're not holding back one iota. 7 woes, right? So again, very conspicuous the way Matthew arranges this. So it's almost like there are smaller categories, smaller brackets, and larger and larger and larger ones. And yet again, done so effortlessly as you're reading through it, you don't even notice it, right? It's almost as if his skill is measured by the fact that you don't even detect what he's doing. That's a good writer. Son of David. Son of David. So this is a major part of Matthew's gospel. So Son of David is a minor motif in Mark. It's a minor motif. But here in Matthew's gospel, it becomes a major theme. So what does that mean? Basically, that you have evidence clearly of Jesus as the Son of David. It's mentioned here and there in appropriate and strategic spots. But here Matthew elevates it and expands it. He broadens it, right? It's a very important theme he wants to strike upon, and obviously it's important to his audience. So here are all the ways in which you have Matthew doing this. The genealogy. We talked about the genealogy in the introduction a little bit. What does he do? The title of the genealogy is Son of David, right? Son of David is not supposed to be the first thing mentioned in a genealogy, right? He's later on down the line, but it's the first thing you hear. This is the genealogy of Jesus Christ, Son of David. It's the title of that genealogy, right? So that's going to be the emphasis. We talked about that. He's even placed before Abraham. Abraham is pretty important in the Old Testament. And here, this is about the Son of David. David is mentioned 4 times in the genealogy. We talked about that, right? He's mentioned at the beginning of the title. He's mentioned where he's supposed to be. And then he's mentioned as a bracketing device, right? Like from Abraham to David, you've got 14 generations. From David to Babylon, you got 14 generations. So he ends up getting mentioned a few times. And then finally, the 14 David in Hebrew, right? We talked about that, the gematria, the DVD, Daleth, Vav, Daleth, how it's not only explicitly mentioned that he is the son of David, that David is important, but even the number appears to reflect David. Now, if you go to commentaries, you'll find that there are a number of suggestions for this 14. David isn't the only one, but it's the one that I like the most because it kind of fits with everything else that's going on. You should be aware that there are multiple options, all of them theological. 14 Old Testament prophecies. Again, I mentioned this in passing, right? Does Jesus fulfill Scripture throughout the Gospels? Absolutely, right? But none of them contain just 14, right? That's Matthew's deal. Mark has Jesus fulfilling Scripture, but you don't have a significant number attached to those, right? Luke certainly does it, and John does it in his own way as well, right? So, again, when we're looking at numbers in the Bible and the Gospels, remember that it's about symbolism and it is about significance. It's never just about counting. Like, for example, and maybe you already know this, if I were to ask you how many miracles are in John's Gospel, anybody have any idea? 7. 7. Not 8, not 9, not 6. 7. Right? That is conspicuous, right? And John goes further, and he doesn't quite call them miracles. What does he call them? Signs. Signs, right? Which is fantastic because he's saying, look, folks, it's not just about the magic act. It's not just about a restoration. They point to something greater, right? And he makes explicit something that the other gospel writers kind of imply as well, right? Remember when he healed the paralytic? What was that all about? Right? It was about healing the paralytic at one level, but in reality, he's proving a point. The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. That's the point, right? Remember the hemorrhaging woman that we looked at yesterday and the little girl, Jairus' daughter? You know, that whole thing, what is that about, right? Here's something to consider. Not only is it about, you know, purity, cleanliness versus uncleanliness. You got the number 12, the symbolism of God's people. You got all of that. You got to also consider that at this time when that gospel is being written, you have Gentiles coming into the church who were by definition unclean, right? Who were outsiders. These healing stories are not just to say, look at what Jesus did. Yes, he did that, but it's also about look at who gets accepted into the kingdom. And you are now like that corpse. You, Gentile, are like that hemorrhaging woman, by definition unclean. But when you come to Jesus, you touch the hem of his garment, or he reaches out to you, you're clean. You're part of the 12, right? So even in those gospels where it just seems like these are just pure healings, they're really about more. In other words, these gospel writers are a lot smarter than we probably assume or make them out to be, or a lot more sophisticated and nuanced in their telling of the stories, in their arrangement of the stories. And it's remarkable that all of this is in there, and I would say this for all of them, in a sense, so beneath the radar for a lot of us. Our reading skills kind of have failed us, right? We just assume, oh, that's what it says. Oh, what's the favorite thing? God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That's true, but what has God said? And you got to go deeper to get that. God is a lot more sophisticated and nuanced than we make him out to be. And when we make God out to be not so sophisticated and not so nuanced, and he's just direct and he just hammers down, that reflects more our attitude, our desires, and maybe even our limitations, which is why God gives us teachers in the scriptures to learn and go deeper, right? It's a longer discipleship process. Okay, 14 Old Testament prophecies. 14 triads in the Sermon of the Mount. A triad basically is a statement with 3 points, right? When you give alms, do not be like the hypocrites, right? Don't blow a trumpet. 1, 2. And the third one, give in secret, right? It's a triad. You've got 14 triads in the Sermon on the Mount. That's amazing, right? I learned this just a few years ago in an article I read from some scholar whom I had never heard of. And he kind of tracked them and showed how you could arrange that. And that fits right into these other 14s. So think about that. Matthew putting together a genealogy with 14, 14, 14, right? You've got 14 being the equivalent of David. You've got 14 Old Testament prophecies. And then even in the Sermon on the Mount, which spans 3 chapters, apparently there are 14 triads that structure the whole thing, right? You know, Matthew is starting to sound awfully smart, awfully technical, awfully sophisticated. And it is the beauty of the gospel, I would add, because I'm not one of these people that says, oh, you have to be a scholar to understand it. People are reached by this with what little they get, what little we can understand, what little we grasp. I mean, at the end of the day, you just have to know Jesus came, he lived, he died, he rose again, and you are to live for him and like him. That's what you got to know. But Paul also says, He wants you to grow in wisdom and understanding. Well, how do you come back to these Gospels, reflect on them, what's going on? And the process is so fascinating. It teaches us things, right? I tell my students, don't just listen to what the Bible says. Look at what it's doing, right? Especially as they're complaining about a writing assignment. Why do we got to write? Why do we create it? Why do we got to have a thesis statement? Why do we have an argument? Well, because the Bible has all of that. And look at how effective they are, right? You want to be an effective witness? Hone in those skills, those God-given skills. The gospel writers certainly did that. Okay, Joseph, Jesus' stepdad, you could say, is also identified as a son of David, right? So again, all of these ways of emphasizing Jesus' connection to David. The list goes on. Jesus is born in Bethlehem like David, right? Now again, in Mark's gospel, you do not have his birth. There is no mention of Bethlehem. In Luke and Matthew, however, you do have him in Bethlehem, being born in Bethlehem. The ways that happens, go in different directions, but Bethlehem is mentioned in both. Interestingly, in John's gospel, you may recall this debate. The disciples are engaging some Jews, and I guess they were, I don't know, if evangelizing or doing apologetics, I don't know. But the Jews, fed up with the disciples, say, wait a minute. Wasn't the Messiah supposed to be born in Bethlehem? Right? When you ask a question like that, what does that imply? What does it imply? What's that? Stupidity. Well, maybe. That it wasn't widely known. They didn't really think he was born in Bethlehem. And the disciples, interestingly, rather than saying, well, just look over at Matthew. There's the story, right? Over to Luke. Of course, these things are circulating perhaps independently. They say, well, come meet him, right? And John's gospel does that all the time, where you have this kind of historical question, right? Give me the information, give me the evidence. And the evidence is always, meet him, right? Meet him. And it's interesting because John almost lets it linger out there. Well, it doesn't matter where he was born if he was in fact born there. Right? Just come meet him. It's the same thing that the Samaritan woman does, right? She comes back to the village and is like, hey, I met this man. He's a prophet, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh, you're nuts. Well, she come meet him. Right? And you always have, it's almost like a bait and switch. You're asking a direct question about empirical, historical evidence. And they say the answer is meet him. Right? Even the disciples, where Jesus is like, hey, I'm going away. Where I come, you cannot go, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, hey, wait a minute. Tell us, how can we get there? We want to go. It says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Right? So you have John's gospel operating at a completely different level in terms of theological depth and understanding. So Bethlehem, but here it is connected to David. That's where David was from, of course. The wise men, when they go to Herod, they ask about the king of the Jews, right? Which again, as we mentioned last time, that's an insult. It's almost a joke. Right? This is a megalomaniac, right? And he is the actual king of the Jews for all intents and purposes. They're asking about David's son, right? So even on the Magi's lips, you have this emphasis on the son of David. Interestingly, the Magi are Gentiles, and they're from the east. And there are Old Testament prophecies that talk about kings from the east coming, right, and laying tribute before Israel and its king. And this is very much like that. They, of course, bring gifts fit for a king, one of which is gold. Matthew adds son of David to episodes that don't include son of David, right? So a lot of these stories are retold, right? And what you often have is a story that appears to emphasize a different aspect, right? So in this particular passage in Mark 7, you have this Syrophoenician woman who comes to Jesus, and her daughter is tormented by a demon, and she just, Lord, you can heal my daughter. And this is not one of Jesus' better moments, it appears, right? Because he says, it is not fit to give the food or the bread that belongs to the children and feed it to the dogs, right? And Gentiles, of course, were considered dogs in the ancient world. They're unclean. Dogs are unclean, by the way. I know everybody wants their dog to go to heaven, right? But in the book of Revelation, it says the dogs are without, right? They're outside the kingdom. Why? Because they're kind of a symbol of what's unclean. I hope your dog makes it to heaven. I'll just say, but just in case, I don't want the pitchforks to come out before the end of the story here. That'll get me tossed real quick. Mess with my pet. Okay, so he calls her a dog, and she's like, well, but even the dogs eat from what falls from the table. And he says, I've not found faith like this anywhere in Israel, right? So here you have an example of another Gentile who exhibits more faith than the people of Israel, right? She calls him Lord, Lord. Matthew tells the exact same story, but in his version, she says, Son of David, Son of David, right? So again, fitting in with this larger theme of the Son of David that is being amplified and expanded throughout this particular gospel. When you ask yourself, to whom does this matter? This matters to Jews. This is why people talk about Matthew's gospel being the most Jewish and perhaps being written to Jews. You don't need, if you're a Gentile, you don't need to be told, hey, Jesus was the son of David. What does that mean, right? David means nothing to me unless you're talking about my neighbor, right? And if he's his son, I'm not following him, right, perhaps. Okay. Matthew adds, reed in his right hand, as Jesus is mocked as the king of the Jews. Remember that the soldiers, they also mock him, right, as king of the Jews, but king of the Jews is on their lips. In Mark's gospel, a reed is taken and they're hitting him with the reed, right? Matthew adds a detail that they actually put the reed in his hand, resembling what? A scepter, right? A king has a scepter. He points it when you're to come to him, etc., right? So even that mockery resembles that he is a king. So whether it's actual respect and honor as a king or mockery, the thing of king, son of David, is emphasized over and over again, right? And it's really interesting when the Magi come to Jesus. Of course, if you read the very beginning, they bow down before him, right? And they worship him as king of the Jews. They do respect to him as king of the Jews. That's at the beginning of Matthew. At the very end, you have the Roman soldiers doing the exact same thing. They bow down before him as king of the Jews, but they're mocking him and they're beating him. And that's Matthew's nice way of bracketing this idea, but also one informs the other. Yes, he is the king of the Jews, but he is a king that is going to suffer and die for his kingdom, right? And you have those kind of held in tension, which is, again, really beautifully done. You have the Gospels doing this kind of thing repeatedly in different ways with different emphases. Okay, the next major theme in Matthew is a prophet like Moses, a prophet like Moses. We talked a little bit about this. Now we're going to go and show you some actual examples. And again, it is remarkable. I mean, I would have been happy if he just gave me the Son of David stuff. That's plenty. Or the 14 stuff. Yeah, I can run on that for years. But then also embedded there are all of these stories and titles and conversations that underscore that he is a prophet like Moses. Now this is interesting, right? Because when Moses was about to die, just before he dies, he says, the Lord your God will raise up a prophet, right? Like me, right? And then he says what? You guys remember what he says you're supposed to do? Listen to him. Listen to him, right? So in Jesus being depicted as a prophet, and particularly the prophet Moses, the correct conclusion is listen to him, right? So look at what's going on. So how does he do it? As we saw before, in subtle and in explicit ways. We mentioned this, the escape to and the return from Egypt echoes the story of Moses and the Exodus, right? Mark does not mention Egypt. Luke doesn't mention it in the same way. John certainly doesn't mention it. But here you have Jesus and his family, escaping to Egypt and then coming out of Egypt, right? There's even a prophecy that says, out of Egypt I have called my son, quoted from Hosea. It's one of the prophecies that are fulfilled, right? In the original context of Hosea, it's Israel being pulled out with Moses out of Egypt. Here, it's Jesus and the family being pulled out. Again, this is the other thing you'll learn about the gospel writers is not so much just what Jesus says, but where is he when he says it? Or what is happening in the background, right? It's kind of like when we have worship up here, right? It's not as if someone comes up here and just sings, right? You've got lights, a little bit of smoke, right? You've got people, you got all sorts of things coming on, maybe even a power, just the images, because all of that help inform what we're doing, what's going on, what this is about. The stories in the Gospels are also like that. Pay attention to what else is going on, right? You can read the story as simply a story of threat and despair and fleeing and then returning to safety. Sure. But when it echoes Moses, it may be echoing not just the pattern, but also where he's going to end up and what he's going to do. The massacre of the infants, as you know, Pharaoh decides, okay, we got to kill all the babies, all the male children because of overpopulation, right? And of course, Herod also decides to destroy the innocents. And this one is, of course, because Jesus is a threat. There's a new king being born. And we all know that these Jews will get riled up and they may overthrow me, right? So we got to eliminate the threat. But in both cases, you have these antagonistic leaders that issue rulings that could destroy the future hero savior. Right? Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness are like the 40 years in the desert. And as you know, in 40 years in the desert, they were tempted over and over and over again. And they tested God's patience. And he judged them a few times, right? And at the end of the day, none of the original generation, except for the spies, right, came out on the other side, Joshua and Caleb. Jesus also is tempted in the desert, right? He's tested by the devil, but he passes the test, right? It's almost as if he succeeds where Israel fails. But again, that's another pattern. 40s, you ever notice that 40, everything happens in 40s, right? In the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. Again, another number that appears to be used symbolically. Jesus, like Moses, is frequently on a mountain. Did you ever notice that? If you were to do a word study and look up mount or mountain in Matthew, you would find it in all these places. Look at that, chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 8, chapter 14, chapter 15, chapter 17 several times, chapter 24, and chapter 28. He's always up on a mountain. You're never really told how he got there, right? It doesn't say, okay, he took a sky tram, he went up to the mountain, right? Or, they were out for a hike or anything like that. It just says he was up on a mountain, right? Now, if you've gone to Israel, you say, well, of course, Hernandez, he was up on a mountain. That place is as hilly as anything. You can't go anywhere in a straight line. It's up and down, up and down, up and down. True enough. But note that Moses was also up on a mountain, Mount Sinai. And it was a place of divine revelation, right? So the Sermon on the Mount, which everybody knows really well, is connected to like Moses giving the law. Right? Moses gives the law on Mount Sinai, and now in the New Testament, Jesus is on a mount as well talking about the law. Right? That's not a coincidence. Thing is, that's connected to other instances of him being on a mount. The transfiguration that takes place, it's on a mount. And at the very end, when he gives the Great Commission, right? He says, go to all the nations and make this, he is on a mount. Right? This is a way of underscoring a prophet like Moses is here. Matthew could have just cut to the case and said, hey, Jesus is like Moses, and it would have been a very short gospel, right? But you've got creativity. You got artistry, right, here. There's even a musicality to it if you can appreciate it. And this is no mistake. Look at it. Half a dozen or more times. The closing formula on the Sermon on the Mount and every other teaching block. So you got the Sermon on the Mount and then the 4 other teaching blocks. At the end of it, it says something like, and with these words, Jesus wrapped up, right? Well, that's actually the same thing you have in Deuteronomy. After Moses speaks, it says, with all this, Moses ceased speaking, blah, blah, blah. So in other words, even just kind of the editorial conclusion of his teachings are concluded stylistically in a manner that mimics, echoes, sounds like, resembles Moses is speaking, right? He speaks, and then there's a summative statement at the end, right? So if you are a Jew in the first century who has been waiting for a prophet like Moses, and you're reading this gospel, you can start ticking off all the ways in which this is happening, right? Which is really interesting. The Gospel of Matthew is not the only one to do it. When Moses had first said, a prophet like me will rise up, listen to him. The original fulfillment of that was actually Joshua, right? Because Joshua was the next prophet in the line, next leader. And if you go to the beginning of Joshua, you start to notice that Joshua does the exact same things that Moses does. He takes his shoes off on holy ground. He crosses the Jordan on dry land. I mean, just there's like half a dozen parallels to Moses. So even the book of Joshua, in describing to us the ministry of Joshua, casts him as Moses. This is a very similar pattern that you have throughout the Bible in more than one spot. So this is a writing style, you could say. 10 miracles. This is perhaps one of my favorite things to think about. You know, everything's my favorite. I'll say that over and over again. It's all my favorite. It's all interesting. So when the people leave Egypt, I'm just going to make a little diagram here. You have 10 plagues, right? They get 10 plagues coming down on the people. They're released, the Israelites are released, and they end up where? Mount Sinai, right? Up on a mount, Moses is there, he teaches them. After the 10 plagues, the 10 curses come and rescue them. In Matthew, you have the other side of that. Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is on a mount, and what happens when he's done? 10 miracles. Right? It's almost like a nice little carbon copy. 10 plagues release the people. They go into the desert. Moses up on Mount Sinai teaching. You come over to Matthew, and Jesus on a mount. And afterwards, there are 10 miracles. That is a wonderful parallel that should not be missed. So the 10 miracles of 8:1 to 9:34, this is in Matthew, recall the 10 miracles of Moses in Egypt. Again, Jesus does miracles in all the Gospels, right? Sometimes he's on a mount, sometimes he's not. But look at the way Matthew has gathered all of this and the way he's arranged it. The Transfiguration echoes the appearance of God to Moses on Sinai. You may remember the story of where Moses, having seen God's back, is shining. He's radioactive, right? And they can't look at him. He's veiled, right? Jesus also, right, is shining, right? That might have been the origin of that hymn. Shine, Jesus, shine. I don't know, but you got the shining Jesus, right? That's like Moses. That connection there should not be missed. And Moses is cited as an authority and explained by Jesus. In other words, Jesus will do a healing, and immediately he'll say, well, you know what to do. Go to Moses and offer up the sacrifice that he commanded, right? Or go get yourself checked by a priest, right? Or when they say, oh, you know, Moses allowed us to divorce, right? Jesus corrects them. Well, yeah, he allowed it, right? But originally it was not like that, right? He allowed it because of the hardness of your hearts. So he explains Moses, right? He corrects people's misunderstanding of Moses. Why? Because he is the prophet like Moses, right? He cuts to the chase. He cuts to the original. He goes behind the traditions that have accumulated around the laws, and he strips them clear, and he says, this is what it was all about, right? So Jesus is a prophet like Moses. And the bottom line there is, listen to him. Listen to him. And again, remarkable that Matthew is able to pull this off. Now, is Jesus like Moses in the other Gospels? Yes. Is he the son of David? Yes, absolutely. But note, they kind of magnify, some magnify one part, and another part perhaps is muted a little bit. Okay. Hey, we got through Matthew. A round of applause. Look at that. God is good. Look, we got like half an hour to spare. We might even get to the rapture. Lord's just going to have to come. There's nothing left to do. Okay, so let's do, and actually for Luke, I have a couple of PowerPoints, unlike the others, because Luke has a particular emphasis that's really interesting. Again, they're all interesting, but it is more characteristic of what Luke likes to do. I'm going to give you the basic one first, which is basically just the shape of his story. So this is the Gospel of Luke, the shape of his story. Again, it's remarkable how you read across these four Gospels. They all kind of sound the same. Maybe they complement each other. It's not until you dig deep that you're like, whoa, they really are doing some interesting things. Luke is definitely no exception. His outline, I'm just going to put this up really quickly. This should be old news for you now. You got a similar pattern to Matthew and Mark, which is, for certainly the birth stories, the Galilean ministry, right? You start in Galilee, transition to Jerusalem, Judea, right? So this goes in a southerly direction. Mark does that, Matthew does that, and Luke, of course. Note, the travel narrative is 10 chapters long. That is that little section in Mark that lasts one verse, right? In one verse, Jesus is in Galilee, he goes to Judea, just there, right? Luke opens that up, and you've got 10 chapters of material, some of which is new, right? So that's a big structural change. Now, the direction is still southerly, but you've got space. You got a road trip where he is allowed to bring in additional information about Jesus. By the way, Jerusalem is really important for Luke. It is a kind of like a theological epicenter in this gospel and in the book of Acts. Everything revolves around Jerusalem. It has theological significance, more so than you might find in the other gospels, even more so than you might find in Paul's letters. Right? Paul kind of downplays his connection to Jerusalem in the book of Galatians. In the Luke Acts, Jerusalem is still kind of an epicenter. Okay. So, the travel narrative, this is Jesus' journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. So, it's an extended section. It takes up to a third of Luke, right? And maybe even it's a little more, right? Because you've got 10 chapters. That's a really huge structural difference, but it is kind of the equivalent of the 5 major teaching blocks of Matthew that resemble Moses. Mark notes the same transition in one verse. We talked about that. Luke inserts a 10-chapter travel narrative between Mark 9:50 and 10:1. So that's actually where you have it in Mark's gospel. Again, we talked about all of this. The shift in storyline is dramatized with the following line. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to Jerusalem. Luke, as I mentioned yesterday, is very dramatic, right? When Peter denies Jesus, there's actually a little scenario where Jesus looks at Peter and he catches him in the act and he starts to weep. Very dramatic. Well, before Jesus heads off to Jerusalem, he sets his face. So it's like he's determined, he's going to go. He's going to follow God's will to the bitter end. He set his face to Jerusalem. And that travel narrative just kind of, Jesus meanders southerly till he gets there, and you've got reminders of him going to Jerusalem. Jesus meanders from Galilee through Samaria to Judea with reminders of the destination. Look at that. 9:53, 13:33, 17:11, 18:31, 19:11. I mean, as if you were going to forget. Right? He says he's heading to Jerusalem. He's heading to Jerusalem. Now, he's going into different towns. He's doing different things. Conversations are taking place. Parables are being told. But Luke keeps his eye on the ball, right? He's heading to Jerusalem. No matter what he's saying here, he's heading to Jerusalem. No matter what he's talking about in this quote, he's heading to Jerusalem. He's heading to Jerusalem. He's heading to Jerusalem, right? Which is also a way, again, of underscoring the importance of that particular city in this gospel. When you get to the book of Acts and you have Paul's missionary journeys, they also revolve around Jerusalem. No matter how far out he goes, he cycles back to Jerusalem. He goes further out, he cycles back to Jerusalem. And he goes further out to the very end where he doesn't cycle back to Jerusalem, but he mentions Jerusalem, right? So again, that's no accident. Jerusalem is the place where at least this prophet will die. Jesus' final arrival to Jerusalem is reported, right? It always reminds me of, Elvis has left the building, right? Everybody, So Jesus arrives in Jerusalem, 1928. Like Matthew's 5 discourses, Luke's travel narrative showcases Jesus' teaching, some of it the same as Matthew's. So here again, you have material about Jesus, stories about Jesus, teachings of Jesus that appear in one location in one gospel, are in another location, are embedded in another structure in another gospel. which shows you something about the freedom of rearranging the material for effect, right? Again, this should not shock us. When you have sermons that are preached, oftentimes they'll start with a story, or they'll end with a story, or they'll move it around depending on what needs to be emphasized. Movies do that all the time, right? If a movie needs to depict, the inner thoughts of an individual, they might refer to sounds or pictures or colors going on outside because you don't know what's in a person's thought. There are different ways of getting at different things you want to teach. The gospel writers appear to do this, right? They're all about teaching. It's all about Jesus. His parables, his sayings, his conversations are all there, but they are rearranged. Now, this is fascinating, right? Because Luke had said at the very beginning of his gospel, others are writing gospels. It's now my turn to set forth an orderly account. Now, when we think of order, we think, okay, he's a physician. It's going to be scientific. It's going to be chronological. It's going to have all the facts, ma'am, just the facts. When you compare it to the other gospels, his idea of order appears to be theological, not necessarily straight up chronology, not necessarily straight up medicine. And also, it's interesting that we think about medicine or Luke as a physician, and we think he's going to dot all the I's and cross all the T's because he was a doctor. Remember, if in fact he was a doctor, and in fact he was the one who wrote this, he's an ancient doctor, right? And they prescribe things that you would not consider scientific, right? I could give you a bunch of prescriptions that would make you howl, as in terms of how unscientific they are, and you would question their usefulness. I will not give you those because there are children in our midst. But ancient medicine ain't modern medicine. So, you don't want to push that. Luke's a physician. He's got it all together too far. It was pre-scientific revolution. Remember that. Okay. The travel narrative also contains unique material, such as the following 10 parables. So these 10 parables are found nowhere else. Okay? 10 parables found nowhere else. And it really speaks to the power of these parables, because as soon as you see these parables, you're going to be like, oh man, I know that parable. Everybody knows that parable. And yet it's only in one gospel. Right? It wasn't even necessary to repeat this parable 3 or 4 times for it to catch on, which really shows the power of the story. Some stories are so powerful that it only needs to be told once and everybody's repeating it. Other stories are not as powerful. No matter how many times you repeat it, you're not going to gain that much of a following, which is an interesting insight into the power of story. You'll know this one, the Good Samaritan. Of course, we talked a little bit about this one. And this one, again, I just always have to underscore how problematic this was for the early hearers. The priest and the Levite were following the law. They are supposed to not touch someone who is bleeding or perhaps dead. They are doing the right thing. And this is really radical, because here Jesus is making a distinction between what is legal and what is moral. Right? The question of neighbor is not defined by proximity, but how you treat those in need. Right? And if you cannot treat those in need because of your law or your legal opinion or thoughts, you are not a neighbor. And to not be a neighbor is to exclude yourself from God's kingdom. Right? What do you got to do to enter the kingdom? Love God with all your heart, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who's my neighbor? See that person in need where you actually might have to break the law to service, to heal? There's a higher law than the law. And it's the law of love, the law of kindness, the law of giving, the law of generosity, the law of compassion, right? I mean, and the priests and Levites had, a leg to stand on. Moses said, it says in Leviticus, you are not to touch blood. It says in Deuteronomy, you are not supposed to touch a corpse. I've been a priest my whole life. All of my fathers were priests. I worship in the temple. I work in the temple. I have done every single thing God has asked me. I've abided by the law. There's a new law. And to get into the kingdom, you've got to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who's my neighbor? There he is. You see Mr. Unclean? You see this guy who is excluded from God's grace? that actually would be illegal to touch, it would be illegal to help, that's your neighbor. And sometimes you have to be like Peter in the book of Acts. You know, whether it's right to follow man or not, I'll leave that up to you. I'm following God's law. And that is a challenge to the church, because historically speaking, the church has been on both sides of the law. Sometimes they're lawbreakers, and sometimes they're not. We celebrate the lawbreakers in retrospect. In our time, we don't celebrate the lawbreakers, right? Because we're very ambivalent about that. There would have been nobody more ambivalent than these priests or Levites who are being told to break the law if you want to get into heaven. They've been following the law all their lives to get into heaven, right? So this is a very radical parable that has been completely anesthetized. I can't even say that. I have better luck with Okoboji. Is that right? Okay, the friend at midnight, another parable. Which of you having a friend at midnight, if he comes and he bothers you in the middle of the night, you don't want to go out there, but he persists, and you're like, shucks, let me get out there. And of course, the point is, how much more so with God? Ask and you will receive. The rich fool is a guy who, first of all, Jesus is approached by a couple of brothers, and one of them says, hey, tell my brother to divide his inheritance. Apparently, brothers always approach Jesus about something. And he's like, who made me an arbiter between you two? And then he launches into this parable about wealth. And the rich fool, why is the rich foolish? Well, basically because he thought, I've got so much wealth. I'm going to build some barns. I'm going to put it in storage. I'm going to set it all up. And the conclusion is, well, you fool. To whom will this go when your soul is required of you, right? And basically it's about treasures in heaven. Invest in celestial treasures, not in earthly ones. To do so is to be a fool in the eyes of God. The fig tree, this one is an interesting. Fig trees show up all over the place. We saw yesterday Jesus cursing a fig tree, right? We talked about him being angry, right? And it almost seemed kind of unfair, right? We talked about that, right? It wasn't the season for figs. I don't care, right? This one's a little more moderate, right? You have this guy who plants a fig tree in a vineyard, and he sends his gardener, and he says, look, this fig tree hasn't borne fruit in 3 years. Cut it down. It's a waste of soil. And the gardener is, a little more circumspect. Well, wait a minute. Let's try something, and let's see if it'll bear fruit, and we'll dig a ditch, and we'll put manure down, and he says, okay, well, if it doesn't give fruit, if it gives fruit in a year, great, and if it doesn't, then chop it down, right? Which is interesting, right? The point there is still that a fig tree that doesn't bear fruit is going to be cut down. And fig trees, again, in ancient Israel, would have referred to the leadership, to Israel, to Judah, anything having to do with the population. But here you have a chance, right? Here there's an opportunity. You've gone 3 years. My inclination is to cut you down. But the gardener has talked some sense into me. And he's going to set some manure down and dig a ditch around it. And we'll see. We'll give you a chance. But if not, you're gone. Right? So really interesting that the same image is being used here. And you have an opportunity to bear fruit. But make no mistake, if you are not doing what you are supposed to do, what you were made for, it is inevitable that you would be cut down. The lost coin, we know this story about the woman who loses a coin, searches the house, right, until she finds it, and she rejoices because she found the coin. This, by the way, is one of 3 parables that are lined up together. The other one is the lost sheep. I didn't include it here because that one is found in other Gospels. But it's the same kind of point. The shepherd loses a sheep. He leaves the 99. He goes after the one that was lost. He finds it. He rejoices, right? So the conclusion of the lost coin, lost sheep are the same. Rejoices, and then Jesus makes the extra leap and says that's the kind of joy there is over a sinner who repents, right? So nice thematic. The prodigal son is the third of those. So it's lost sheep, lost coin, and then the prodigal son. It's a little more elaborate. You guys know this story. This is probably another one of those most famous parables. And when he comes back, what is there? There's a party. There's rejoicing, right? And again, it is supposed to represent repentance and the joy that occurs in heaven over a sinner who repents, right? And Luke has arranged these nice and thematically. Lost coin, lost sheep, and then this lost son, the prodigal son. The dishonest manager. This is one of the more confusing parables that you have of Jesus. It almost sounds anti-Jesus, right? Because the point of this parable is basically make friends with dishonest wealth. So that you may have a place to go when it's all said and done. And he even says the people of the world are wiser than the people of the kingdom, right? It's a very perplexing parable. Do you guys know this parable? Basically, you've got this guy who's about to get fired because he's mishandled his boss's finances. And he says, so settle your accounts, before I let you go. And what does he do? You guys remember what he does? Yeah, he starts offering discounts, right? And I think this guy mishandled the funds. Now he's going to go to the debtors and mishandle them some more, by offering discounts. You owe 100, write down 80. You owe 50, write down 20, right? I mean, that's not just mishandling. That almost sounds like stealing, right? And then more perplexing, the master commends him. Wow, what a prudent thing to do, right? And then Jesus chimes in and says, make friends with dishonest wealth. I say, what is going on there? For the love of God. I say, I don't understand. How did that get in there? Of all of them, you're going to include Luke, you're going to include that one? Maybe you should have weeded that one out. I don't know. Well, the scholars have bent over backwards to try and make it work. One theory is basically that when he went, this dishonest manager went to the people, what he cut out was the commission, right? He received a commission from collecting debt. So let's say $100, right? 20 is my commission, 80 is what you owe. Give me 80, cut my commission out, right? If he's doing that to everybody, giving everybody a discount, he's taking it, right? He's taking a hit there. And the idea is I'm going to be out of a job. When I'm out of a job, you can help me. Remember when I gave you a break? I was owed a commission, but I gave you a break, right? I like that. Of course, the problem is Luke doesn't say that, right? And it doesn't mean that it wasn't that, but here's the other thing that you should be aware of. Remember that the Gospels, and this is true of the New Testament, true of the entire Bible, as much as you like to believe it, it was not written for you. Right? Not immediately. It was written to a particular audience. And that audience might have been a Jewish or Greek audience, might have understood the connections and what there are things that perhaps would have been resoundingly clear to an ancient reader that needed no explanation, that leave us entirely in the dark. So an ancient reader might have heard that story and said, well, I know exactly what's happening there. Boy, Jesus was right. Boy, that's really wise. And we're like, wait a minute, aren't you the guy who says don't steal, right? And to be honest, and I mean, you already called this guy a dishonest manager, and you're going to tell him to go out there and handle more finances? I mean, the first thing you do is get the money bag away from him, right? So you have to allow room for the possibility that something is going on here that would have made perfect sense and doesn't to us. I'll give you a quick example of that. In Corinthians, Paul talks about women wearing veils or having long hair, right? And he gives the reason why that's necessary. You know what he says? Because of the angels. And then he says nothing else. What do you mean because of the angels? That makes it worse, right? I had no idea angels were involved in this veil thing, right? But the Corinthians, whom he had met and spoken with and worshiped with and written to and gone back and forth, this was a long-standing, ongoing conversation. Him saying, because of the angels, like, yeah, remember he said that? We a small group, we're talking about angels and. And again, scholars have bent over backwards, right, to try and figure out what does that mean. And it's interesting because the solutions they often offer sound good, but they raise more questions. Like one of them is that, you got in Genesis, you got that weird story about the sons of God looking upon the daughters of men and copulating, and then giants are born from them, right? Remember that whole story? Some scholars think that actually what's happening there is that that's referring to that tradition, so that the angels don't look lustfully upon the women, cover their neck. And you're like, but didn't Jesus say when you go to heaven, you're going to be like the angels who neither marry nor are given in marriage? And then you wonder, well, how in fact could they actually copulate? And, it just raises more questions, right? So sometimes you probe as far as you can, and then you say, you know what? I wasn't there. I don't know what Paul meant. I wasn't in the congregation. I missed that day, right? Okay. So dishonest manager will say, hey, there's more going on there. The rich man and Lazarus. The rich man and Lazarus. This is a great parable. You guys all know this parable. People usually get caught up in the idea of hell with this parable, and they often say, well, you see, Jesus talked about hell, and here it is, right? And you could probably not misuse that parable a worse way, right? Because the question of hell is not the central question. If you were to ask Luke, is there a hell? Well, say, of course, I'm using the story, right? The real question is whether you will end up there. That's the real question behind this parable. And the way in which you can determine whether you will or will not end up there is by asking yourself whether you are Lazarus or the rich man, right? And the rich man is not, you say, well, I'm not wealthy, thank God, right? No. The problem with the rich man was not his wealth, but his wealth vis-a-vis Lazarus, right? The fact that there are those in need while you are glutted with money, right? And it's today, it's even harder for us to say, well, I'm not aware of the needs. We just see it all over the place. You have to try to think that this world is not in desperate need and filled with Lazaruses, right? But we'll get to that in our next PowerPoint about Luke, which we'll probably get to tomorrow. I think we'll make it to John. The widow and the unjust judge. This is the widow who comes to the judge. The judge is evil. He's disinclined to help her, no incentive, but she's so persistent. And what is she persistent about? Being avenged of her enemy. She's asking for justice over and over and over again. And finally, the judge is so weary. He's like, oh, this lady's going to kill me, right? I will avenge her of her enemy just as she leaves me alone. And of course, Jesus chimes in and says, how much more will your heavenly Father answer your prayer? But note, it's not just any prayer. It's a prayer for justice. She's asking for justice, and she's asking it of an unjust judge who doesn't want to help her, but he's selfishly tired and says, whatever. God, on the other hand, is eager to answer a prayer about justice, right? And that's kind of the point in that one. Very interesting. The Pharisee and the publican. This is something you have running throughout Luke's gospel in a way that's far more prevalent than the other gospels, and it is a juxtaposition between powerful and powerless, between rich and poor, even between male and female, holy and unholy. Throughout his gospel, he does that over and over again to illustrate a point, and usually it's a reversal of fortunes, right? The one who is unjust is justified, right? The one who is rich is made poor, and the poor is made rich. The one who is powerless is made powerful, etc. The humble are raised. This is an example of that. The Pharisee, he's in the temple. He's praying to God. He's, Lord, I thank you that I tithe twice, fast twice a week. I tithe. I do all the, he's just on and on and on about all the wonderful, just things that he's done to inherit the kingdom. And then you have a publican, which is basically a tax collector, the most hated of the occupations in Jerusalem. And he's on his face and he's on his chest and he's saying, be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus says that guy went home more justified than the other guy. That's something that Luke does over and over and over again. We'll talk about that extensively tomorrow. Hey, that's it. Oh my God. Let's see. I got 3 minutes. Questions? Well, I have to praise the Lord for that. We made it. Okay, yes. Yeah. Okay, so the question is, I was taught to repeat the question yesterday. Is it significant that the fig tree had been around for 3 years and that one more year was going to be given, right? Because Jesus' ministry lasted 3 years. That's correct, right? Okay. So whether the 3 years is significant, I don't know. Luke has not been as, hitting that nail over and over again. The parallel with Jesus' 3-year ministry is one that needs a little exploration. So here's the question. And we have 3 minutes. Maybe that's also tied in. The Lord works in mysterious ways. How do you know Jesus had 3 years of ministry? You don't. You've been told that, right? You've been told that. Where does the information come from? Well, here's the news flash. If you're weak in the faith, close your ears, right? If not, listen boldly. The idea of Jesus possibly having a 3-year ministry comes from John's gospel. And why do you have that? Because in John's gospel, Jesus attends various feasts. Some of these occur yearly, like the Passover feast. And you've got 2 mentions of Passover, right? So you can have 3 years in between it. You can have 2 years, right? But there are also other unnamed festivals. So we surmise, based off of John, that he could have had 2.5 or more year ministry. But that is just John. And he doesn't straight out say it was a 3-year ministry. The synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, only have 1 Passover. 1 Passover. And, a lot of teaching. It's not like it was October, right? It was December. You don't have any of that. So the gospels, the 3 first gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, appear to reflect a 1-year ministry, right? So even things like this that we've inherited, right? And we want to make that connection, you have to probe that. And then it gets worse. Because in John's gospel in particular, every time Jesus does something, there's some sort of festival in the background. There's some sort of Passover being mentioned, right? And it's so conspicuous that it ties into what he's saying. So you ask yourself, does John mean the Passovers literally or not? Because if he's not using them literally or not including all of them, then you may not have enough to say 3-year ministry. Right? The numbers are important. I'll give you one last example. We'll end it because I could go on for another hour. Okay. So you all know that 7 is important, right? A number of completion of perfection, right? The wedding at Cana. Remember that? Wedding at Cana, Jesus is there, and he apparently never missed a party. And they've run out of booze. And his mom comes to him and says, what? They run out of booze, right? I mean, like, he's a guest. What are you telling me for, right? And he responds in a way that you should never respond to your mom. Woman, what business is of mine? I mean, it's like you earned a smack across the cheek for that, right? What are you saying, right? And he says something very interesting. My time has not yet come. I was like, she's expecting me to do something. It's not time yet, right? But she knows her Jesus, right? So she just goes back and says, do whatever he says, right? And so what does he say? Fill the jars, right? And of course, you know what happens. They turn into wine, and it turns out that it's the good wine. Do you ever notice how many jars there are? 6. 6. Just shy of 7. It's not his time yet. Isn't that amazing? All right, I'll leave you with that. We'll see you tomorrow.